Let me ask you a question. Have you ever noticed how much news channels they love a good crisis? Like during hurricane season, every news station suddenly becomes hurricane headquarters, just wall-to-wall coverage. Storm trackers, wind models, reporters leaning into the rain for dramatic effect, and of course, breaking news every 10 minutes. And whenever I see the media overhyping a storm, I can't help but think of my all-time favorite weatherman, Jim Kosek. So this is from a few years ago, but watch this.
Oh boy. 14 to 22 inches of snow. Oh boy. Well, I'm AccuWeather.com meteorologist Jim Kosek. Our paralyzing, crippling, record-breaking storm comes today! Road closures, flight cancellations in the hundreds, power outages by the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Yes. And problem number one to start it all today, 35 degrees. So when the snow comes in, kicks temperatures down sub-freezing, so what initially melted turns to black ice. That's only one problem. Problem number two, 14 to 22 inches of snow! Winding down Saturday afternoon. Tertiary problem? Yeah, I've been reading the dictionary. Blowing and drifting! 3, 4, 5 feet drifts! So you shovel, drifts back over, shovel, drifts, shovel. Could I get a one-way ticket to New Orleans? Sun comes back Sunday, Monday. Listen, I love crab cakes, but we could replace it with jambalaya. More snow showers later Tuesday. I'm meteorologist Jim Kosek. Oh boy.
Have you ever noticed the quiet disappointment that reporters seem to have when a storm doesn't turn out as bad as they predicted? They'll build it for days, just dramatic graphics, urgent music, and then 9 times out of 10, it's not nearly as severe as they thought it would be. But isn't that a lot like life? How often do we convince ourselves something is going to be a disaster, our worst fears coming true, an operation, a test in school, a meeting with a boss. We'll agonize over it. We dread it. We play out worst case scenarios in our minds. We lose sleep. But then it happens. And it's not nearly as bad as we imagined. And that's exactly where we're going to find Jacob as we continue our study through Genesis chapter 33, because the moment he has dreaded for 20 years, it's finally arrived. It's time to come face to face with the brother who wants to kill him, riding towards him with 400 men. And what we'll learn from this showdown between Jacob and his brother Esau is that fear, it's driven by imagination, but reality is driven by the Lord. So let's pick it back up in Genesis chapter 33, verse 1. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. Well, we learned back in chapter 32 that Jacob had been up all night wrestling with the Lord. And let's be clear, that was never a wrestling match Jacob could win. This wasn't about Jacob conquering God. It was about God conquering Jacob's heart. The wrestling was simply the final tool the Lord used to break Jacob's self-reliance, to bring him to surrender. And we saw the turning point when Jacob, out of sheer desperation, stopped fighting and started clinging. He started to hold on to the Lord for dear life. And that's when everything changed. God changed his name. He would no longer be Jacob, the heel grabber, heel catcher, the manipulator, the self-striver. Now he'd be called Israel, contends with God, or God fights. But don't miss this. Just because Jacob surrendered, just because he was now holding on to the Lord, it didn't mean the circumstances disappeared. Esau was still coming. The army of 400 men was still marching in his direction. The threat was still very real. What changed wasn't the circumstances. What changed was who Jacob was trusting to handle it. He no longer had to fix it himself. He was holding on to the Lord for dear life. And this is so important for us because God doesn't always remove the circumstances surrounding our fears. He doesn't always take away the medical bills. He doesn't always remove the test that we're losing sleep over. He doesn't instantly always fix the marriage strain. He doesn't always erase the memories that haunt us. But in the middle of painful circumstances, we are not alone. We don't have to live trapped in fear, letting our imagination run wild with worst case scenarios. Instead, we can hold on to the Lord for dear life, regardless of what we face. Because fear is driven by imagination, but reality is governed by the Lord. That's why we cling to Him instead of clinging to our fear. Verse 2, He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. Well, remember Jacob's strategy back when he first heard about Esau's army of 400 men? His plan was to split the family into two camps. So if Esau attacked, at least only half of his family would be wiped out. And that was the plan of a man operating in fear, a man trying to manage the damage himself. And you can see he scrapped that part of the strategy. He no longer divides the camps. He places his whole family in the hands of God. That's growth. That's surrender. But he's still not perfect. Even while holding on to the Lord, you can still see traces of fear in how he orders his family. He lines them up, wives and children, literally in the order of who he loves the most, with Rachel and Joseph placed at the safest position farthest from danger. And if we're honest, that's painfully relatable, because it's one thing for me to trust God when my life is on the line. It's another thing entirely when it's my kids, when it's the people I love the most. Like Jacob, my faith can be real, but still imperfect, growing and not finished. And Jacob, he isn't finished either. But watch this, because despite his lingering fear, look who steps out in front to face the army of 400 men. Verse 3, he himself, that's Jacob, he went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. I love these stories of the Old Testament because I love to picture what they actually look like in real life. Try to see this moment for the first time in his life. Jacob, he's limping because that's what it took for the Lord to break him. One touch to the hip. And the self-reliant man who had spent his whole life running, striving, and manipulating now walks in front of his family with a limp. And we talked about what a limp is. A limp is a permanent reminder of pain. You don't hide it. You can't hide it. You don't outgrow it. You carry it. And for Jacob, now named Israel, every step forward came with that reminder. Step, limp. Step, limp. And with each limp came the memory of that night, the night he stopped fighting God and started holding on to Him for dear life. Probably, it looks something like this. Now, I'll just say it. The Last Jedi may go down as the most controversial and worst Star Wars movie of all time. But even if you don't love the film, you got to admit there was that one visually powerful scene where Luke Skywalker was standing alone, walking out in front of the entire First Order army, one man, one Jedi against overwhelming force. Slow steps, wind blowing, face set, a standoff, a Jedi, a man versus an army. And yet, the way they wrapped up, that frustrated me and all of us a lot. But I digress. Because when I read the moment that we're here in Genesis, that kind of picture, that's what I see. Here comes Esau's force, 400 men, and out in front of his family, Jacob limps forward alone. Step, limp. Step limp. Behind him stands everything he loves. His wives, his children, his daughter, his flocks, his possessions, all that God has entrusted to him. And unlike Luke Skywalker, Jacob, he's not walking out to project strength. He's not there to intimidate. He's not there to deceive. He's not there to stall for time. He's walking out in surrender and humility. In fact, Scripture tells us he bows 7 times. 7 times he lowers himself to the ground as he approaches his brother. Now, this isn't the posture of a fighter, of a Jedi. It's the posture of a man who has finally been broken and now trusts that God will do the fighting for him. Just compare Jacob back in Genesis 28, the last time he saw his brother, to the man we meet here in chapter 33. Because the contrast, it's stunning. Back then, he was full of pride. Now, he walks in humility. Back then, he was a self-made, scheming, striving man manipulating outcomes. But here, he's a God-made man, broken, surrendered, and dependent. Back then, he was stealing from his brother, taking what wasn't his, and now he's giving to his brother, lavishing his brother with gifts. Back then, he clung tightly to his own wants, his own plans, his own advantage, and now he's holding on to God for dear life. Back then, his very name was Jacob, heel grabber, deceiver, catcher, but now he bears a new name, Israel. Contends with God, or God fights. And what you're watching in chapter 33, it's what happens when a man stops fighting for himself and trusts God to fight for him. His 11 sons don't miss this. They're watching. They're standing there. They're seeing this all unfold. They're watching their father, the great patriarch of their family, limping for the first time forward and bowing in humility before the brother he once wronged 7 times. Now listen, can you imagine the impact of that moment? Because fathers don't just teach with words. They teach with posture, with repentance, with humility, with how they handle broken relationships. And it's fascinating when you look ahead a few chapters, because 10 of these very brothers will one day wrong their own brother Joseph. They'll betray him. They'll sell him, pretend he's dead. And years later, they too will stand before a long-lost brother that they sinned against. And before reconciliation happens, guess what posture they take? They're going to bow in humility, just like they once watched their father do. Almost as if that moment here in Genesis 33 planted a seed, a living picture of what repentance and reconciliation looks like when God is the one doing the fighting. Verse 4, but Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Do you know what this moment reminds me of? The weatherman, Jim Kosick, an overhyped weather forecast, because when fear takes over, our imagination does the same thing that the news does with a storm. It builds it up. We dread it. We agonize over it. We lose sleep over it. We rehearse worst case scenarios in our minds. But when the moment actually happens, it's not nearly as catastrophic as we imagined. Or in Jacob's case, it's the exact opposite happens. Instead of conflict here, there's compassion instead of violence. There's embrace instead of revenge. There's reconciliation. And all that pent-up fear, it releases at once. In tears, in relief, sometimes even in laughter, because 20 years had changed everything. And here's the reality that Jacob couldn't see when he was panicking the night before. That God wasn't just transforming Jacob, he was working in Esau too. While Jacob was being broken on one side of the wilderness, God was softening a heart on the other side. Because remember, fear is driven by imagination, but reality is governed by the Lord. Well, somewhere along the way, Esau had likely come to terms with the past, maybe even accepted that Jacob was the one God had chosen. And God had blessed Esau too. Despite not receiving the birthright, he had become successful, wealthy, and influential enough to command an army of 400 men, which means this meeting was never going to be decided by Jacob's strategy, but by God's sovereignty working in both brothers' hearts at the same time. I want to pause here for a really important question. If his heart actually longed for his long-lost brother, why bring an army of 400 men? Well, because just like Jacob had no idea what God had done in Esau's heart, Esau had no idea what God had done in Jacob's. For all that Esau knew, Jacob was coming back to scheme again, to manipulate, to take all he had again. The last version of Jacob that Esau remembered was a deceiver. So those 400 men may not have been an attack force, but rather they may have been a protection force, to guard against what Jacob might do. And isn't that interesting? Jacob's imagination led him to fear what Esau might do to him, while Esau's past experience led him to fear what Jacob might do to him. Both men were approaching the same meeting with completely different fears. But then Esau sees something he never expected. The proud, calculating Jacob that he remembered is gone. Instead, he sees a broken man limping forward, bowing in humility 7 times. And in that moment, Esau can see this isn't the same man who left 20 years ago. The old Jacob is gone, and it's probably that realization that cracks Esau's heart open and begins the tears rushing out. Verse 5. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." Do you hear the difference in Jacob's attitude? It's subtle, but it's powerful. This is no longer the voice of a self-made man, no longer the tone of someone who believes he has engineered his own success. Something has shifted. Something is softened. And after wrestling with God, you don't walk away the same. Your perspective changes. Your language changes. Your posture changes. Even how you view your life story is transformed, because when you've been broken by God, you stop taking credit for what only God could have done. And that's exactly what we're hearing from Jacob now. For the first time, he's giving credit where credit is due. The blessings, God did it. The provision, God did that too. The protection, oh yeah, that was God again. This is the voice of a man who no longer sees himself as the architect of his own life, but as the recipient of God's grace. Verse 6. Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. Last of all, Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Don't miss what's happening in this moment. Yeah, this is an incredible reconciliation. Yes, this is a beautiful reunion between 2 brothers. But don't forget the backstory. The whole reason Esau wanted to kill Jacob was because Jacob stole the blessing. That moment shattered their relationship. That theft drove Jacob into exile. That wound, it lingered for 20 years. And now, here they stand face to face again. But look at what Esau is being introduced to. He's not just meeting his brother. He's meeting the outcome of the blessing from Abraham to Isaac that was passed to Jacob. He's looking at Jacob's family, his wives, his children, and whether he realizes it fully or not, he's staring face to face at the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. Because the blessing was never just about wealth. It was about lineage. It was about covenant. It was about nationhood. Standing in front of Esau are the very sons who would become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. In other words, Esau, he's not just reconciling with Jacob, he's witnessing the reality that the blessing truly rested on Jacob all along. Verse 8, Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met?" Well, Esau, he already knows what the animals were because Jacob told the servants delivering them as gifts exactly what to say. They were gifts to earn favor. So Jacob says, "To find favor in your eyes, my lord," he said. But Esau said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob. "If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably." Does Jacob know something about seeing the face of God? Yeah. I mean, don't miss the connection to his words here. They're not random. They're not poetic exaggeration. They're flowing out of something he just lived through the night before. Because remember, after wrestling with the Lord, Jacob said, "I have seen the face of God and lived." Well, that moment, it marked him. It changed how he saw everything. So now, having lived through that encounter, having survived the wrestling, having come out on the other side of being broken but blessed, he now stands face to face with Esau. That moment, remember, he feared for 20 years. And instead of death, there's embrace. Instead of revenge, there's tears. Instead of judgment, there's welcome. And Jacob is so overwhelmed because he realizes something in real time, that the softened heart of Esau is not a coincidence. It was God's work. The same God he wrestled with him. The same God who broke him, the same God who renamed him, had gone ahead of him. So that when Jacob looks at Esau's face, he's not just seeing his brother, he's seeing evidence of God's grace. Which is why he can say, in essence, seeing your face, Esau, is like seeing the face of God. Because he knows only God could have done this, and was exactly what God had promised him before he left, all the way back in chapter 28. "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Well, back here to chapter 33, verse 11. "Please accept the present that was brought out to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Now, this moment reveals something powerful about Esau's heart towards Jacob. Because when Jacob presses the gifts on him, this isn't just about livestock. It's about reconciliation. And culturally, for Esau to refuse the gift would have been a massive insult. And in that world, gifts like this weren't casual. They were relational. They were peace offerings. They were visible expressions of restored honor. To reject the gifts would have been to reject the reconciliation. So when Esau finally accepts it, he's not being greedy, he's being gracious. And it actually takes humility to receive it, because acceptance means he's willing to let the past stay in the past, which shows us this. Reconciliation, it's not one-sided. Jacob is humble enough to offer, and Esau is humble enough to receive. And that mutual humility is what makes the reconciliation complete. Verse 12, "Then Esau said, 'Let us be on our way. I'll accompany you.'" And now we enter an interesting section of the story, one that reminds us the Bible doesn't record what we wish it said. It records what actually happened. And this isn't Disney. This isn't a fairy tale. It's real life. Because after this emotional reunion, after all the tears and after the embrace, Esau says in essence, "Come on, brother, let's go home together." And if this were a fairy tale, that's exactly what would have happened. They would have ride off side by side back to Esau's home, to a great feast, a full restoration, and then roll the credits. But that's not what happened. Instead, reality happens, because while Esau may have sincerely wanted Jacob to come live with him in the land of Seir, that wasn't Jacob's priority anymore. Reconciliation was the goal, but relocation wasn't. Jacob had been sent back to the land that God promised him, his calling, his covenant, his future. That was tied to where God was leading him, to the land of Canaan, not to where Esau was living. So this moment shows us something important. You can have genuine reconciliation without resuming the same proximity or life path as before. Peace was restored, but their callings were still different. And Jacob, now walking as Israel, was committed to following where God was leading, even if that meant parting ways again, this time in peace instead of conflict. Verse 13. But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are tender, and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard just one day, all of the animals will die. So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and the herds before me, and the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." Esau said, "Then let me leave some of my men with you." "But why do that?" Jacob asked. "Just let me find favor in the eyes of my Lord." So what Jacob says to Esau here, it's true. I mean, at least on the surface level, his children are young. The flocks are vulnerable. They simply couldn't keep pace with an army of 400 men moving at full speed. So practically speaking, his explanation makes sense. But if we read carefully, it also feels a little bit familiar, because Jacob seems to slip just a little back into old patterns. He speaks a half-truth. He tells Esau, "I'll come to you in Seir." But we know he never does. He has no intentions of relocating there. So while his concern for his family is legitimate, his communication isn't fully transparent. And that gives us a couple of important principles to wrestle with. First, even when a broken relationship is reconciled, healthy boundaries are still appropriate. Reconciliation doesn't automatically mean full relational access again. Trust can be restored, but wisdom still moves carefully, especially in relationships with a contentious or painful history. It's okay to rebuild slowly. It's okay to maintain space. It's okay to prioritize what God is calling you to. Number two is God can still bless imperfect obedience. And we've seen that in Jacob before. But Jacob, he didn't need to hide his true intentions here. He could have simply said, "Hey, Esau, God is leading me somewhere else." But even in his less than perfect communication, his overall heart posture is still towards God. He's no longer scheming for advantage. He's no longer manipulating for gain. He's walking forward in the direction God has called him, even if he does so imperfectly. And that's encouraging for us, at least it is for me, because God's faithfulness to our calling, it's not dependent upon our flawless execution. He blesses surrendered hearts, even when they're still growing out of old habits. So verse 16, so that day Esau started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. You can actually see on this map that Jacob, he doesn't head towards Seir at all. He goes the opposite direction. And interestingly, this detour, it doesn't seem to damage the reconciliation. There's no fallout. There's no renewed hostility. In fact, the next time we see Jacob and Esau together will be in chapter 35, when they stand side by side to bury their father Isaac, which is a beautiful picture in itself. Just reconciled brothers honoring their families together. But here in chapter 33, Jacob leads his family somewhere very intentional. He takes them to a place of rest. The place is called Succoth. And the word Succoth literally means booths, tabernacles, or tents, which might sound familiar. If you've ever heard of the Jewish Feast of Booths, the Feast of Sukkoth, it's the same word, same imagery, temporary shelters, a place of covering, a place of pause. And we're not told how long they stayed, but the sense we get is that Jacob wasn't rushing forward anymore. After 20 years of running, after the fear, the wrestling, the reconciliation, he just slows down and lets his family and the animals rest. You might even picture it like this: the first family of Israel on their first camping trip, tents set up and flocks grazing, children playing, a season to breathe before stepping fully into the land God had promised. Verse 18, after Jacob came from Padan Aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan, encamped within sight of the city, which brings us to an important detail, because where Jacob settles next is right on the edge of a prominent pagan city in Canaan. And if you've been tracking with us all the way through Genesis, that should set alarm bells off, because we've already seen this pattern before. When God's people camp on the edge of a pagan influence, bad things tend to happen. Lot, he pitched his tent near Sodom. Then he moved into Sodom. And then Sodom moved into Lot. Proximity led to compromise. And here, Jacob does something similar. He doesn't move fully into the city, but he settles close enough to be influenced by it, close enough for his family to interact with it, close enough for its values, its dangers, its culture to begin pressing in. And as we'll see next week, that decision carries consequences, because partial obedience, living on the edge instead of fully where God has called you, often opens the door to pain that God never intended you to walk through. Verse 19, for 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. There he set up an altar and called it El Elo Israel. Jacob doesn't go straight to Hebron, to his father's home. Instead, he stops short and purchases property in a town nearby. And in that moment, that detail is more significant than it might seem at first, because when you look back at Abraham never owned land in the promised land except for a tomb, a burial cave. That was it. The man God called to inherit the land died without possessing it in his lifetime. But here we see Israel, Jacob, his grandson, purchasing land, planting roots, settling his family. It's a quiet but powerful signal that God's promise is moving from a vision to a reality. But even more important than the land that Jacob buys is what he builds on it. He builds an altar, and he names it Elo Israel, which means God is the God of Israel. Don't miss what Jacob is doing here. This isn't just worship. This is fulfillment. He's fulfilling a vow, a promise he made to God 20 years earlier. Think back to chapter 28, after the dream of the ladder to heaven at Bethel. After that incredible encounter with the Lord, Jacob made a vow. Now, if you remember, it was conditional. He said, if God will be with me, and if he watches over me, and if he provides food and clothing, if I return safely, then the Lord will be my God. When we studied that, we called it what it was, which was a swing and a miss. Because after the out of this world encounter with God, Jacob's response was basically, well, if you come through, then I'll trust you. But now, 20 years later, God had proven himself. He had been faithful. He had protected Jacob. He had provided. He had brought him home. God delivered on every promise. And now Jacob builds an altar and declares, God is the God of Israel, not the God of my father, not the God that I'm testing, not the God I'm negotiating with, but he is my God, the God of Israel. Because over 20 years of walking with him, Jacob learned something we all have to learn, is that fear is driven by imagination, but reality, it's driven by the Lord. So as we close our study of chapter 33, I want you to step back and take in the whole picture of Jacob's journey. Because what we've watched unfold, it's not the story of one man. It's the story of what happens when God gets a hold of a broken life. We've watched Jacob, the self-made man, become Israel, the God-made man. We've watched a deceiver become a worshiper, a striver become a clinger, a man who grabbed blessing become a man who builds altars. And what changed everything? It wasn't his strategy. It was his surrender. It was that night of wrestling, that moment when he stopped fighting God and started holding on to him for dear life. And there's the takeaway for us. God may not remove every circumstance that you fear or that you face. Esau may still be on the horizon, The army may still be coming. The conversation may still have to happen. But when you've wrestled with God, when you've surrendered, when you're holding on to Him, you realize you're not facing those circumstances alone. Because while you were worrying, God is working. While your imagination was building storms, God is softening hearts, arranging outcomes, going before you. And somewhere along the journey, you begin to learn what Jacob learned, is that fear is driven by imagination, but reality is driven by God. So maybe the question as we close is just simple. What fear are you holding on to today? What circumstance have you been agonizing over, losing sleep over, dreading? Because the invitation of this passage isn't go fix it. It's hold on to the Lord for dear life. Cling to Him, trust Him, walk forward even if you end up with a limp. And as you do, you may discover what Jacob discovered, that the God who you wrestled with is the same God who went ahead of you.